To most of America, the identity of the 35-year-old man who wrote the Constitution of the United States is a secret, hidden in plain sight. Sure, the final content was a group effort, it was a legal agreement, but our deeply venerated founding document was written by one man's pen. It was his structure, in his style, with his rhetorical skills, which were famous at the time. Now they're just casually mentioned in long lists of Constitutional Convention attendee bios. As a little aside, most Americans have never heard of the guy. But not only did he write the final draft, he authored its first and most famous words, the preamble itself, "We the people of the United States," in order to form a more perfect union. And with that opening line, he established a nation. The original opener was "We the people of the states." Well, that document would have been a treaty between sovereign powers like the European Union. We the people of the United States. That created a national identity with the stroke of a pen. And it turned that document into a declaration of membership. There are huge portions of America that say in polling they think that the work was divinely inspired. The Constitution's the most important piece of writing next to the Bible, and yet most have no idea who the author was, which is very strange the more you look into it. I mean, it's not like he was a boring person or somebody easily overlooked. He was a towering man, over 6 feet tall, with a wooden peg leg, which he got when a carriage ran him over at the intersection of Logan's Alley and Dock Street in Philadelphia, while he was fleeing the consequences of an extramarital affair, not his marriage, hence the danger. After the accident, one of his friends, fellow founding father John Jay, hoped he'd learned his lesson and might avoid, quote, "the pleasures and dissipations of life into which young men are too apt to be led," end quote. The ghost, which is how I'll refer to him for now, being such a fan of words, he replied to John Jay saying, quote, "You argue the matter so handsomely and point out so clearly the advantages of being without legs that I'm almost tempted to part with the other." It's not like the ghost was some outlier, unknown to the great powers of the world. He was a contemporary of George Washington. And being of similar foreboding stature, he served as Washington's body double for the general's statue in the capital of Virginia. The French consul called him, quote, "perhaps the most eloquent and ingenious man of his country," end quote. The U.S. Army Center of Military History said the ghost displayed, quote, "great personal courage as the only diplomat who refused to flee Paris during the bloody Reign of Terror." The ghost spent a lot of time in Paris. He was friends with Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before she was beheaded in the Revolution, and he was so close to the royals and the aristocrats he decided to keep some things as souvenirs. So he bought Marie Antoinette's intricately decorated armchair set and had it sent back to the Bronx. Well, he almost didn't make it back himself. He got intercepted by a crowd of French revolutionaries who decided to kill him. But he made up a great story that he'd lost his leg in the American Revolution, and he told it so well they started cheering for him. There's another version of the story where he's simply waving the leg out the window of his escaped carriage with a lady friend, shouting, "Vive la Révolution!" He was notorious in France as well for his extramarital relations, having been known to engage in them publicly at the Louvre before it was home to the Mona Lisa, back when it was a royal palace. In his diaries, the ghost used the word "celebrating" as a code word for sex. In one of his entries, he writes of an affair, "We, quote, go to the Louvre. We take the chance of interruption and celebrate in the passage while Mademoiselle is at the harpsichord in the drawing room. The husband is below. Visitors are hourly expected, and the doors are all open," end quote. The ghost, this prolific writer of erotica, wrote our nation's most revered document, yet most have never heard his name, not even once. They don't know where he came from or what he stood for, what he believed in. They don't know what he opposed, what his philosophies were based on. We don't know how deeply he felt that that final draft of the Constitution compromised basic human values, or eventually, as conservative historian Richard Brookhiser describes it, quote, "the man who wrote the Constitution judged it to be a failure and was willing to scrap it," end quote. Most modern Americans don't know that the Constitution was actually barely ratified. In New York, it passed by the skin of its teeth by 3 votes. And in the years following its signing, throughout the 1800s, politicians frequently referred to the Constitution as a compromise. Professor Aziz Rana at Cornell, in his essay, Why Americans Worship the Constitution, he refers us to a Massachusetts senator of the time, Daniel Webster, who said the Constitution was a detente between North and South over the matter of slavery, meaning a temporary halting of hostilities. Professor Rana goes on to say that, quote, for many individuals living at that time, it would have been far more likely to imagine the Constitution being replaced with a new one than to conceive of a 21st century America that deifies the old text, end quote. Echoing the sentiments of Jefferson, who said at the time that every constitution and every law naturally expires at the end of 19 years, which was Jefferson's math for allowing each new generation to set the course of their own societies. The agenda of deifying our Constitution as a religious-like parchment, while totally obscuring its author in our origin story, has been highly effective in service to the winners of that compromise, the slavers' side, who represented the extreme end of a political spectrum, ones who genuinely believed in oligarchy, rule by a few over the many, with some caveats and crumbs thrown in to make for good rhetoric. And that compromise, memorialized in our Constitution, inevitably led to a civil war. And another set of similar compromises led to the civil rights crisis of the 1960s, which ended with a string of political assassinations and another lurch backwards. And another mirror set of similar compromises, which led to the cultural and political cold civil war which our country finds itself in again today. All of which lead back to a false origin story about our Constitution, what it was, who wrote it, and why, which only helps keep this cycle going on repeat. So who was the ghost who wrote the Constitution? Well, if we studied it a little bit or remember the story from school, we likely think the primary writer, the so-called architect, the father of the Constitution, was a guy named James Madison. The ghost called James Madison a sexless drunkard. Madison was known to down a pint of whiskey a day. He was also a Virginia slaver who'd inherited a huge tobacco plantation, a forced labor camp that had been passed down for generations. James Madison's great-great-grandfather, Isaac, left London and arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1608. A year after its founding. Jamestown is, of course, famous for being the first permanent English settlement in the Americas, a business endeavor established by the Virginia Company of London, a place also famous as the destination for the first 20 African slaves who arrived in August of 1619, after which the 1619 Project is named. A century later, James Madison's grandfather Ambrose was overseeing 29 Africans, 10 men, 5 women, and 14 children, working for free on more than 10,000 acres in a plantation complex the Madisons called Mount Pleasant. Ambrose suddenly took ill and died in August of 1732, and 3 African Americans were subsequently convicted of, quote, feloniously conspiring the death, end quote, by poison. One of the Africans was a man named Pompey. He was hung for the crime. As the new country was in the throes of revolution, James Madison was writing to a friend that the major Achilles heel of the colonies was the British offer to free the slaves. He wrote, quote, to say the truth, that is the only part in which the colony is vulnerable, end quote. As Jill Lepore reports in her comprehensive history book, These Truths, quote, in James Madison's county, slaves had been convicted of poisoning their masters in 1737 and 1746. In the first case, the convicted man was decapitated, his head placed atop a pole outside the courthouse, quote, to deter others from doing the like, end quote. And in the second, a woman named Eve was buried alive. Their bodies were made into monuments, end quote. When James Madison gets to Philadelphia, representing the slave state of Virginia, slavers are being opposed by the Quakers, who'd banned it and founded a relief society to help escapees. Samuel Johnson, one of the most famous, most respected British writers of the time, had ridiculed the colonists' demands for freedom in an essay called Taxation, No Tyranny, in which he said the whole endeavor was absurd when the loudest yelps for liberty were coming from slave drivers. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, the Surgeon General of the Continental Army, and a civic leader in Philadelphia in a state of outrage, asked what's the difference between, quote, the British senator who attempts to enslave his fellow subjects in America by imposing taxes upon them contrary to law and justice, and the American patriot who reduces his African brethren to slavery contrary to justice and humanity, end quote. The slavery abolitionist movement was only momentarily swept aside when the Revolution began. And now that independence had been won for the slavers and the free states alike, that conflict was back on center stage. While Madison was working on a constitution with 54 other colonial delegates, he had a workforce of over 100 enslaved people running his estate and his household, which is a large number but also common in practice to the whole aristocracy of Virginia. So now we have a sense of his worldview. So what's the justification for saying Madison wrote the thing? Well, there are a few. Madison wrote most of its marketing materials, which they call the Federalist Papers, particularly to get New York to sign it, which they barely did. James Madison also took the most copious notes we have of those secret meetings, the Constitutional Convention, which happened in 1787 between 55 delegates who wanted to speak freely and not send their constituents and this entire new, very precarious political arrangement into further chaos. Chaos was the situation in which they found themselves. The new republic was in imminent danger of collapse. That's why they were meeting in secret. To wage their revolution, these colonial leaders had borrowed millions of dollars from the rest of Europe, who saw a political advantage in damaging the British Empire. The French, the Spanish, the Dutch, they'd all invested and they were expecting returns with interest. But the new colonial union that was operating under Articles of Confederation, they weren't a strong enough entity to squash the next phase of the revolution that was underway at that moment in Massachusetts. There was a Revolutionary War veteran. His name was Daniel Shays, and he was peacefully marching with his fellow vets and local farmers, and they were demanding relief from a new set of oppressive taxes at the hands of their new government. There's a story about a widow of a Revolutionary War veteran. She'd taken ill. Tax collectors came and took her bed while she was sleeping in it. Well, Daniel Shays' rebellion was definitely gaining in popularity. George Washington, he writes to a friend, Henry Knox, he says, if our new government is, quote, unable to enforce its laws, anarchy and confusion must prevail, end quote. Shays was organizing protests at county court hearings, and he was stopping debt collectors in their tracks. So Washington wrote desperately to another friend and staff member saying, quote, commotions of this sort, like snowballs, gather strength as they roll if there's no opposition in the way to divide and crumble them. James Madison was terrified that Shays' rebellion was going to spread to Virginia and said to Thomas Jefferson that Shays had, quote, tainted the faith that this new republic would even last. In 1787, the Massachusetts governor instituted martial law and sent a 3,000-man militia to put down Shays' rebellion and regain the federal armory. That's when the New York Congress finally started taking James Madison seriously and accepted the proposed Philadelphia Convention for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Well, in preparation, James Madison had written the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan always gets lots of attention in history class, mostly because it presents a seemingly dry and uncontroversial idea of a government where a small deliberative Senate can operate as a check and balance against a more blah, 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 who cares? Madison also wrote an essay called, quote, Vices of the Political System of the United States, a list which included failure of the states to comply with the constitutional requisitions, meaning states weren't paying enough taxes. and, quote, encroachments by the states on the federal authority, meaning states weren't being obedient enough. He'd also jotted down that, quote, in Republican government, the majority, however composed, ultimately give the law. What is to restrain them? Armed with his plans and notes, James Madison joined 54 other men in Philadelphia to basically lock horns and argue and debate and argue some more for 3 months straight before they agreed on a new central body to govern them all. Edmund Randolph, another wealthy Virginian, he set the tone for the whole thing, and he didn't mince his words. The African Americans who were once imprisoned on Edmund's uncle's work camps had revolted against their family. They joined a British colonial military unit formed entirely of formerly enslaved people, led by British officers and sergeants. Well, they'd not revolted against his entire family. Edmund's father had fled as well, choosing loyalty to England. And now, in the face of Daniel Shays demanding more equitable tax policy, Edmund Randolph warned gravely against, quote, the prospect of anarchy from the laxity of government everywhere. This revolution was going too far. As much as anything else, the Constitutional Convention was being convened to stop the spread of liberty and slow the continuing revolution, lest it unseat power from the aristocracy that started it. During one of the constitutional debates, James Madison made this very clear, saying, quote, the government we mean to erect is intended to last for ages. The landed interest at present is prevalent, meaning there are many who own land. Quote, but in process of time, when we approximate to the states and kingdoms of Europe, when the number of landholders shall be comparatively small, he goes on to say, will not the landed interest be overbalanced in future elections? And unless wisely provided against, what will become of your government? In England at this day, if elections were open to all classes of people, if property of the landed proprietors would be insecure, an agrarian law would soon take place. He sounds like the evil emperor in a Star Wars movie. By agrarian law, he means he's concerned about a political system run by peasants. How ghastly. Madison goes on, quote, our government ought to secure the permanent interests of the country against innovation. Landholders ought to have a share in the government to support these invaluable interests and to balance and check the other. In other words, the wealthy need to be able to solidly check the power of the peasants. And then he says in no uncertain terms that the composition of the Constitution should, quote, protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. In other words, protect the rich from the poor. We can easily see in whose interests it might be to deify James Madison. Along with the Constitution, he undeniably led in form, but the writer of the final document was not James Madison. It was the ghosts. It was the ghost of an America that could have been. The actual scribe, the holder of the pen, and writer, would speak more than James Madison at that convention. In fact, he would give more speeches than anyone else. 173 speeches over the course of the convention. He was the main speaker. Speeches that are almost never quoted, never referred to in our current discussions of American government. James Madison himself generously said of the ghost, the man who would write the final draft of the Constitution, that, quote, the finish given to the style and the arrangement of the Constitution fairly belongs to Mr. Morris. A better choice could not have been made as the performance of the task proved. Mr. Morris, Mr. Governier Morris, is the ghost who wrote the U.S. Constitution. And knowing him, centering him in the narrative of the story of that founding document where he belongs, creates an entirely different understanding of the nature and identity of our country. His position at the convention wasn't just as a delegate from Pennsylvania, or even as just an American, but in his words, quote, in some degree as a representative of the whole human race, end quote. His first name, Governier, is French. It was his mother's maiden name. It means governor, but he wasn't one, not officially. From the U.S. Army Center of Military History, as a young man, quote, Morris could have avoided military service. He was handicapped. Scalding water had badly damaged his right arm in a childhood accident, and as a legislator, he was automatically exempted from militia duty. But he viewed active service as a moral obligation and joined one of the special militia companies proliferating in New York City. These units predecessors of the modern National Guard, trained in uniforms the members purchased themselves and acted as the city's Minutemen, ready at a minute's notice. By early 1776, they'd formed 2 complete regiments. Morris was asked to serve as second in command, but he withdrew when the militia declined transfer to the Continental Army. The Revolution divided his family. His mother was a British loyalist. She brought in British soldiers to camp at his estate, leaving him homeless. 2 of his sisters married loyalists. His half-brother served as a general in the British Army, and the other half-brother, Lewis, signed the Declaration of Independence. But Morris wasn't homeless for long. Research professor Forrest McDonald at the Alabama University, after having reviewed many of his personal letters, writes that the range of Morris's reading was enormous. And when he quoted someone in a letter or conversation, as he frequently did, he was more likely to cite Shakespeare or Lord Chesterton than some political thinker. Indeed, like many another framer, particularly those of the Federalist persuasion, he distrusted speculative theory and preferred to rely on observation and history and common sense and judgment. Morris would become the senator of New York. He would help design its grid, in other words, the entire layout of Manhattan, replacing the European system of winding roads and circles. And then Morris would write the New York Constitution in the chaos of the Revolutionary War with his friends John Jay and Robert Livingston. It was a simple document based on English constitutional law, removing the royal elements, of course, but it had profound effects. It jump-started New York's development, established a university and a common school, set up academies and funded libraries and a structure of assistance to the indigent, to the poor. The Constitution of New York also initiated drafting a plan for the construction of canals. Morris jumped on that momentum, helping lead in the creation of the Erie Canal, dramatically affecting the history of global development. As Brookhiser writes, Morris, quote, served as a commissioner and explored possible routes himself, trekking through the swamps of western New York. Lewis and Clark went farther and saw more, but along with the mayor of New York, Morris and the other projectors of the Erie Canal accomplished more by linking heartland farmers and East Coast merchants and foreign markets, end quote. This was the longest artificial waterway, the greatest public works project in North America, transforming New York City into the nation's principal seaport, and subsequently New York, the global center of business, commerce, banking, finance, retail, transportation, tourism, media, advertising, legal services, accountancy, insurance, theater, fashion, and the arts. That's Governier Morris's legacy, aside from the Constitution of the United States. James Madison oversaw a forced work camp and became president. Let's contrast some of Mr. Morris's statements with James Madison's at that Constitutional Convention in 1787. This is what Mr. Morris said during an argument over slavery's continued allowance in a new constitution. Quote, I can never concur in upholding domestic slavery. It's a nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevails. Compare the free regions of the Middle States, where a rich and noble cultivation marks the prosperity and happiness of the people, with the misery and poverty which overspread the barren wastes of Virginia, Maryland, and other states having slaves. Travel through ye whole continent, and you behold the prospect continually varying with the appearance and disappearance of slavery. The moment you leave ye eastern states and enter New York, the effects of the institution become visible. Passing through the Jerseys and entering Pennsylvania, every criterion of superior improvement witnesses the change. Proceed southwardly, and every step you take through ye great regions of slaves presents a desert, increasing with ye increasing proportion of these wretched beings, end quote. Now, in this time and context, Mr. Morris uses the word wretched not as a pronunciation of the character of Africans and work camps, but in an earlier meaning of the word as an adjective, describing someone in a state of profound unhappiness and misfortune. Mr. Morris goes on to talk about the insanity of the slave states proposing to use slaves to count for their state's population and thus their representation in Congress. Morris exclaims, quote, upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. End quote. He goes on, the admission of the slaves into the representation when fairly explained, comes to this: that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina, who goes to the coast of Africa, and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections, and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in government instituted for protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. Domestic slavery is the most prominent feature in the aristocratic countenance of this proposed Constitution. The vassalage of the poor has ever been the favorite offspring of aristocracy." End quote. Morris means by that vassalage that human beings without money and power are more often than not forced into subordination or submission by an elite ruling class. And he goes on, quote, "And what is the proposed compensation to the northern states for a sacrifice of every principle of right, of every impulse of humanity? They are to bind themselves to march their militia for the defenses of the southern states, for their defense against those very slaves." And he goes on, speaking against the southern slavers, burdening the North with taxes to not only protect their evil enterprise, but by keeping Africans in misery and abject poverty, preventing Africans from contributing to this national enterprise through taxation, as the northern citizens will. Then he accuses the slavers of hoping to bring in more slaves, creating a greater chance of rebellion against which they will expect the North to provide military support. James Madison responded that apparently Mr. Morris, quote, "reduced to the dilemma of doing injustice to the southern states or to human nature. He must therefore do it to the former," end quote. Madison, a slaver, considered reducing the power of the slave states an injustice. Well, this is just one of Gouverneur Morris's 173 speeches, the greatest speeches of the convention by far. You might be a little outraged that we weren't taught this in school. Perhaps we should be. In his other speeches, Morris opposes the system that we're currently using for electing a president, in which former slave states with smaller populations have outsized power in picking our country's chief executive, which has subsequently led to 2 times in the past 20 years where a president was elected who lost the popular vote and turned the entire nation against itself. During those initial negotiations over the contents of the Constitution, Mr. Morris made a clear argument for a popular vote, arguing that the people should elect a chief executive, not a political assembly, saying presciently, quote, "If the legislature elect, it would be the work of intrigue, of cabal, and of faction. It will be like the election of a pope by a conclave of cardinals. Real merit will rarely be the title to the appointment," end quote. There was a version of the Constitution in which the Senate was going to elect the president. Can you imagine? Gouverneur Morris made sure that didn't happen. The Electoral College was a compromise. You know, the presidential veto. That's a power that was introduced by Gouverneur Morris. He also argued for the freedom of religion. There was a Frenchman once who had insisted that every country have one established religion. To that, Mr. Morris said, quote, "God is sufficiently powerful to do his own business without human aid. Man should confine his care to the actions only of his fellow creatures, leaving it to God to, quote, influence the thoughts as he may think proper," end quote. At that constitutional convention, Mr. Morris also warned gravely against the weaknesses of democracy, particularly its vulnerability to corruption. Once again, his predictions were chilling in their accuracy. Quote, "History informs us that both in ancient and modern times, the leaders of popular assemblies have been bought by foreign powers, and thus nations unconquerable by arms have become the victims of seduction," end quote. Well, he wasn't only concerned about foreign corruption, but also domestic. At one point, he floated the idea of a Senate elected for life for this reason. He said, quote, "The rich will strive to establish their dominion and enslave the rest. They always did, they always will. The proper security against them is to form them into a separate interest. Let the rich mix with the poor, and in a commercial country, they will establish an oligarchy," end quote. Morris was not only concerned with domestic corruption, but the corruption of the individual. saying, quote, mankind reasons from their prejudices, their circumstances, their interests. Thus, in the most important affairs, like grown persons at the dancing school, we have much to unlearn, as well as to learn, before we can think and move with ease and grace. We must cast off our prejudices, rise above our circumstances, and divest ourselves of a pitiful regard to our interest, whether pecuniary or political. Hard task indeed. He was thoroughly appalled by the so-called Great Compromise, wherein the smaller states sold their souls, allowing the perpetuation of slavery in exchange for having an equal Senate vote. Morris warned if the southern states, quote, get power into their hands, end quote, they would inevitably bring the nation into another war with their expansionist dreams. And that they did, under the stewardship of none other than James Madison, first as Secretary of State and then as president. Madison accelerated a second war with Britain. The history books call it by the most boring name imaginable, the War of 1812. Well, this was a serious affair. Morris railed against the Madison administration's warning of the disaster to come, and his words were unheeded. Madison tried to annex Canada, believing American troops were going to be greeted as liberators. Jefferson agreed, saying it would be easy taking, quote, Canada this year. As far as Quebec, it'll be a matter of mere marching, and will give us the experience for the attack on Halifax, the next and final expulsion of England from the American continent, end quote. Well, they made 10 attempts to invade Upper Canada and failed. And in retaliation, the British invaded the United States. New England was occupied by British forces in July of 1814. And on August 24th, British troops arrived at the White House. James Madison and his family barely escaped. They fled to Maryland. So the British soldiers, they just sat down and ate the White House kitchen leftovers before they ransacked the presidential mansion and set the White House on fire, along with the U.S. Capitol. Madison served the rest of his presidency while living at a friend's house. By September, the British had advanced into Maine and New York State. A naval assault on Boston was imminent. Trade had ceased with the world. Unemployment rates were soaring. The economy was in a depression. By August, the banks were suspending services. The whole federal government was about to declare bankruptcy. So what does President James Madison do? He proposes a draft. He sends a conscription bill to Congress. Madison was turning the nation toward tyrannical military rule, the very kind of abuse that Governier Morris had warned and feared. Morris called Madison deceitful. He used words like imbecility. And he joined the sentiments of almost every major Federalist Party newspaper in New England calling for secession and the creation of a New York-New England Confederation. Morris believed the Constitution had failed in its mission to check the power-hungry Southern slave-holding aristocracy that dominated the new American Republic. 15,000 Americans died in the fighting. Canada earned a proud military heritage, and the Native Americans, they lost the most. Many had joined the British cause, hoping they would win back territory stolen by the U.S. government, but those promises were abandoned in the peace negotiations. A final military triumph in New Orleans, under the leadership of none other than slaver Andrew Jackson, was used by Madison and Jefferson's allies to convince Americans that the War of 1812 had been a glorious success. Jackson had used the opportunity to force the native Creek Nation to hand over 1,500 square miles of what would soon become the state of Alabama and portions of Georgia. And once again, the abolition of slavery movement, which had been swept aside by another war, would move to center stage, setting a course for civil war. Governier Morris passed away in 1816 at 64 years old. 3 years after he'd become a father for the first time. The mother of his son was his former housekeeper. He'd married her when he was 47 and when she was 25, making the shocking announcement to his guests at a Christmas party. When Morris died on November 6th, 1816, it happened in a pretty disturbing manner, so trigger warning for the next 20 seconds, plug your ears if you're faint of heart. Morris had been struggling with a blockage in his urinary tract, so he used a piece of whalebone as a catheter. And not being a surgeon, he caused internal injuries and an infection which killed him. He passed away in the same room in which he was born. The public peculiarities of Morris's life made it all too easy to paint him as a historical footnote, controversial, odd, good for a chuckle, but not to be taken too seriously. While glorifying James Madison, raising him as the architect and father of a holy constitution, obscuring history and reality completely in service to Madison's goals, again, in James Madison's words, quote, to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, end quote. And in Morris's words, in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity. On this, Mr. Morris also had insight, saying that people, quote, do not go into administration as the direct road to heaven. The only way to secure the most virtuous is by making it in their interest to act rightly, end quote. So the task is in our hands. One step might be to center the writer of the U.S. Constitution back into our origin story where he belongs. The alternative is burying his story, his wisdom, warnings, an accurate framing of what that document was and wasn't, and what America is and isn't. But that has haunted us like a ghost for centuries.